What makes a person good and another person evil?
People will say, oh, I'm in the medical business and you don't know anything and you're an anti-vaxxer. My answer to that is, well, shame all these people weren't anti-vaxxers. They wouldn't be dead and dying if they were anti-vaxxers. His heart hasn't been the same. He's had every test under the sun. I think it's about $190,000 he's incurred in medical expenses, none of which he's getting back. When he rang me and told me that, something really happened to me. I thought, now I'm going to play dirty. And I said, I'm really sorry to hear that, but has anyone said that a lot of these cancers are coming from the vaccine? And he got really upset. We ended up having a hug and a cry together. And he said, I hadn't thought of that. We cry every week, frankly. Something reduces me to tears every week. And then I got onto the subject of ivermectin, which made her almost hyperventilate. And she just said, oh, what rubbish, no. And I said, quite frankly, you're lying to me, I can tell. These people don't have a conscience.
Rosie Marshall, welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Now, I've often described COVID and the ensuing vaccine mandates as the biggest catastrophe in Australian peacetime history, and it was all self-inflicted. Is that a fair enough description?
Yes, it's been a very disappointing episode in humanity altogether. But having had this experience of COVID, it's led me to believe that the greatest hoax perpetrated on humanity has been the vaccine industry. And the worst thing is, we've known about it for over 100 years, that these have been bad. But for reasons that are beyond my comprehension, people refuse to face the fact that vaccination has been a disaster.
Yeah, well, people's ability to ignore the truth or find alternative truths is as old as human history itself. So we shouldn't be too surprised about that. But let's just zero in on COVID to start with.
Yeah.
How do you think, why did it start?
Well, I think it's been planned for many, many decades. I think this is all part of a larger plan that if you dig deep enough and listen to people like David Martin, who's an authority on patents, he uncovers the fact that the patents for this so-called disease were taken up a couple of decades ago. And when you look into the whole vaccine industry and Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca's history, you'll find that the vaccine was actually produced prior to any illness. The whole thing is extremely suspicious, and to have mandated these injections on humanity was truly a crime, because the people believed, the governments throughout the West, for reasons that show either incompetence or malfeasance, refused to look into it any more than taking Pfizer's word for the trial data. And again, that has, I think it's 1,926 adverse events are described in their trial data, but none of the agencies that are here to protect us, like the TGA and the CDC, actually went to the trouble of finding out.
Let's go back to the start of the COVID panic. I remember reading in March 2020, I think it was on the front page of The Australian, a little graphic, and it explained the odds of COVID being fatal if you caught it, according to which age group you were. And anyone under 70, it was negligible, and the only at-risk cohort was over 80. At that point, I thought, well, that's a relief. This panic is over, but it wasn't. How did it, even against such obvious information, how did the COVID panic take hold?
Fear. And I think it was very cleverly done. The whole thing was orchestrated. I'm going back to March 2020 when I smelled a rat. I was already primed to be dubious about what we were told by the medical profession. We'd had an incident in my own family where a child was vaccinated with a childhood vaccination and had a very, very serious reaction. And the NHS, because it happened in England, told the family that she had an underlying virus at the time, which was a downright lie. And they blithely said, oh, when her next vaccinations are due, we'll have a cardiac resuscitator near her. And I just thought, how insane would you have to be? So I had my doubts. But in March 2020, my husband and I were going off on a cruise via Africa, and my doctor, who's very, very proactive about everything, he does love to prescribe a pill for anything. He said, "Oh, you must take hydroxychloroquine." And I said, "Oh, you know, I've taken these things for malaria when I visited India a few years ago, and I think they make you a bit crazy." Well, he reassured me. He said, "Oh, no. This millions of people take this. It's perfectly safe." And so, rather reluctantly, I got the script filled out. So off he went, and we literally had one foot on the gangplank when the cruise was called off because of COVID. And I had not really been even slightly concerned about it. When, you know, people were saying to me, "Oh, are you sure you're wise to go?" And I just thought, "Oh, what nonsense." So back we came to Sydney, and I revisited my doctor, and I said, "Look, sounds like HCQ is a good idea. Can I have another script?" And he went into quite a blather, frankly. He said, "Oh, no, it's dangerous," which, of course, he'd reassured me it wasn't 6 weeks earlier. And then he said, "Oh, the pharmacy won't give it to you." And I just kept questioning him. And I said, quite frankly, "You're lying to me, I can tell." And needless to say, the relationship faltered after that. But anyway.
Well, that's a really vivid little microcosm of our relationship with the medical industry these days. One minute your family doctor, I presume,
Yeah, it was
is
for 10 years.
telling you how safe hydroxychloroquine is, and 6 weeks later, someone's got in his ear and he's changed his mind. Who got in his ear, do you think?
AHPRA wrote a letter to every person in the medical fraternity.
Sorry,
and said,
who wrote?
AHPRA.
Oh, AHPRA, yeah. So that's the
Australian Practitioners
Health Protection Regulation Association, I think it is.
Yes.
And just to be clear for the viewers, that this is the government body that oversees registration of all medical practitioners. So if you fall out with AHPRA, they can ruin your career, and they have done so, and they did so with particular vindictiveness during COVID.
To Miley Trin. Dr. Miley Trin was one of their victims.
Yeah, well, we can get to that in a minute.
Dr.
But so you think AHPRA got in contact?
I know they
with
did.
Okay.
I know.
So your doctor, 1 minute, is saying hydroxychloroquine, safe, you must take it. 6 weeks later, AHPRA has been in touch and said hydroxychloroquine is unsafe. What's the process? Why has AHPRA said that?
AHPRA had, under emergency use authorisation, there could be no alternative to having a vaccination. And the entire medical fraternity was threatened with losing their licence if they didn't promote vaccination, if they caused vaccine hesitancy. Yep. Bear in mind that AHPRA takes, I think it's 600...
But this is March 2020.
Yeah.
So they were planning the vaccine that early.
Yes. And just bear in mind that every practitioner pays a fee to AHPRA. I think it's of $650 a year to keep in their good books. So they're very wealthy. Yeah. They've got a lot of clout.
Right.
And they use it quite indiscriminately.
So when the other startling development at that time was a thing called National Cabinet. Had you ever heard of National Cabinet before then?
Was this the task force they'd identified to push the vaccination? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, it's a quorum of the Prime Minister and the state premiers, essentially. It used to go by another name, and it wasn't an official organisation, but suddenly Scott Morrison was talking about a thing called National Cabinet, and its deliberations have been kept secret ever since, as if it comes under the auspices and the protection of actual cabinet, and there are secrecy protections about actual cabinet. Anyway, it was quite sudden and coordinated that Australia needed a unified, almost like a war room cabinet to deal with this virus that we now know was relatively harmless. Where do you think the political response came from? Was that under the instruction of the pharmaceutical industry as well?
No, I'd love to know the source of that. That is the big question. Who is holding the strings? You can call it the World Economic Forum, you can call it the WHO. They're all at UN. I mean, all these people are in cahoots. There's no question. But it is all about money, and it's about reducing people to fear-driven, pathetic, spineless little fools.
But if it's all about money, why are politicians are well paid? What's in it for them?
Well, it's interesting that they seem to be so much better paid than their salaries, isn't it? That Albo's now got a $4.3 million house somewhere, and he's got a new highway to drive to it. I think there's a lot of backhanders. I think there has to be. Judging by what happened in Britain, and I've spent quite a lot of time in the UK in the last year, it's absolutely tragic what's happening there. But the reality of the skullduggery that went on in the UK, I imagine, is typical, and I don't imagine that it's any different here. I mean, Clive Palmer did accuse Gladys Berejiklian of having some relationship with Pfizer, that they had got in her ear about promoting the Pfizer vaccination, which she obviously did, and her sudden resignation was tied up to that. And of course, the criminal investigation never made clear what the actual problem was. But if you look into her replacement, Tim James, he's the replacement in her seat. Well, he's ex-Pfizer. Apparently there's nothing to see there, and who am I to question anything?
These corporations are and it's no secret, and it's not as if the information isn't easily available, but these corporations are hands down some of the most evil corporations in history.
How can
They're
you question
responsible
it?
for tens of thousands of deaths, and in fact their business model is often based on how much damage they can cause, what the cost of the damage they cause is against the profits they make.
Well, in 1986, that became clear that was the agenda. Suddenly, the childhood vaccinations went up from about 10, and currently in America, I think it's 72 before the child gets to school. Here, it's 43 until you're 4, and if you're Aboriginal, you're unlucky enough to get 47. And I have a friend who has worked extensively with the Aboriginal community, and apparently ADHD and autism is rife in little Aboriginal children. Yeah, it's more coincidences, Fred.
So you started Forest of the Fallen after the casualties of the vaccine program became undeniable. Tell us about how you started that.
Well, it goes back a bit before then. As I mentioned, by 2020, March 2020, I realised we weren't being told the truth. I tried to warn people. You can imagine how popular I was when I was saying to everyone on the northern beaches, the Insular Peninsula, where everyone does as they're told. I started saying things like, I think you should take ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine rather than getting these experimental injections. So my friendship group diminished rapidly, but I have made a whole lot of very interesting new friends. And I was very, very upset because I saw friends taking these things, and I was extremely concerned, and of course my family. Anyway, I had the very good fortune of going to a meeting at Tunks Park where there's a Freedom in the Park movement. And
this is on the northern beaches of Sydney?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's near Northbridge. By this time, I did have a very small amount of notoriety because I'd started going into chemists and saying to them, are you aware of the increasing number of deaths as a result of the vaccination that you're so happily giving to the community? And by that time, I'd actually looked into it a bit further and realised that informed consent was a priority, via the Nuremberg Code. I knew that. And I was saying to them, are you actually getting informed consent? And it got to the point where I was saying things like, if someone dies as a result of the needle you've just pumped into them, how are you going to be? They say, our insurance covers us. And I'm thinking, it doesn't matter if you kill someone. Anyway, it was about this time, one of my sons...
Can you just elaborate on that, though? I mean, what were those encounters? You would just walk into chemists and say, do you realise that there's a...
And I'd film it.
Oh, okay.
And that was the beginning of my notoriety.
And what sort of response were you getting? Was it hostile?
By the fourth visit, it was getting a bit hostile. But I think I've done every chemist in the Northern Beaches now. So I'm known.
Have you been physically removed?
Oh, once my phone was being wrestled from me. Actually, it was quite funny. One of them said, I can see you're filming me. And I said, oh, yes. And he sort of jumped at me and tried to wrestle my phone from my hand. And I was a bit shaken by that. But I managed to retain my phone. And I walked round the corner to some friends of mine who run a printing shop. And in fact, they print all the Forest of the Fallen flags for me for nothing. And I said, I was a bit shaken by that. That man round the corner at the pharmacy, he got a little bit frisky, not frisky, but a bit physical. Anyway, my friend there, because I'd never really explored how to put things on Twitter, she said, you better put that on. She thought it was quite amazing. She said, I'll put it on Twitter for you. So she showed me how to do it. And I said, it's probably a waste of time. I mean, I didn't really achieve anything. I think it got something like 30,000 views. So, I mean, these pharmacists have now got the warning, because there is now a trend of people going around pharmacies and saying it because it's the truth. We're actually telling them the truth. They are crossing the line of the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code made it very clear that people could not be coerced into taking what is in effect a stabbing in your arm of something that you're not happy with. So they're liable.
Does the Nuremberg Code actually apply in Australia? I mean, they might be right that their insurance covers it, though. They might be indemnified.
No, they're going to find that they're not, because they have not. Even the Pharmaceutical Guild identifies the things that one has to ascertain before you pump some rubbish into someone's arm. Have I got this entirely right? Certainly you have to have no coercion. Secondly, you have to tell them what alternatives they are. And thirdly, you have to tell them what the likely reactions can be. Well, you'd be there all day identifying the 1,927 adverse reactions that they're likely to have. They don't know what's in it, and they're not telling anyone about alternatives. And they're definitely, during the mandates, there were people going in there saying, I don't want to have this, but I'm being forced to, and they should not have done it. That really is even the pharmaceutical board. And every now and then I do something rather, I get curious and I ring people like the insurance companies and I say, my son's a pharmacist and one of the people he's injected has had a very bad reaction and I'm wondering whether he's going to be all right. And the insurance companies get very edgy at that. And they say, you better get a lawyer. I'm thinking, yeah, he's heard this before. So it's happening.
Based on that response, do you think this is happening already?
I think, apparently the European courts are confronting this problem now. And also Julian Gillespie has worked very hard on this. There have been so many people who've tried really hard. I mean, I personally have gone to my federal member and spent an hour with her describing everything that goes on.
Is this Sally Stegel?
No, it's Sophie Scumps.
She's a teal as well.
Yeah, she's a teal.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting. Were the teals receptive?
No. Sophie,
but you still got an hour with her.
Well, what happened was, it was a bit of a story, really. It's all a bit of a story. She was, basically her arm was twisted into coming and seeing a Forest of the Fallen. And she was very sympathetic. I mean, she's got a very sweet, practiced manner about her. These teal women.
I just want to explain, though, the Forest of the Fallen is it's a presentation of hands on sticks, isn't it? With photographs of people. Can you describe what the Forest of the Fallen is?
The Forest of the Fallen was initially initiated by a very lovely woman in Tasmania called Selkie, who has for many years realised the danger of vaccination. She started collating stories and then she got together with Jab Injuries Australia. And Jab Injuries Australia were getting huge numbers of people coming to them and telling their stories. So they got together and they decided they'd start making up a very big PDF. In fact, I think I've got something like 730, what we call flags now, photographs and stories of what's happened to people since they took these injections. And we laminate them. I've got them double-sided, laminated, and we secure them on bamboo sticks. And because I live in the northern beaches, and the beaches are such a magnet for large crowds, I just go and every weekend I'll go and put my sticks in the sand in the beach. And I get my deck chair out and I sit and people come and talk to me. I always do a video of an overview of what's happening and whatever has happened in the previous week, because I'm always getting phone calls and messages from people telling me the shocking things that happened to them. So I do an overview, and then if anyone wants to talk to me, I invite them to do a 2-minute interview, which I put out on social media. And some
How many times have you done the Forest of the Fallen?
Oh, I think it's nearly 2 years every weekend. I have been away, and I've got a wonderful crew of people who help, and so they've stood in for me when I haven't been there. But honestly, if I didn't have the Forest of the Fallen, I think I'd be in a straitjacket with frustration.
Tell me about your encounters when you put this out in public. It's a bold thing to do, even now, to assert that you are sceptical, to put it lightly, about the effects of vaccines. What is the rate of opposition and support that you get in the public?
Well, needless to say, it's rapidly altered. Initially, I just say the very first one I did, we went to Manly, and Manly's a fairly compliant area, and there are a lot of medical people around the Manly and Shelley Beach areas, and it's when you do Forest there that you have the most opposition, and people will say, oh, I'm in the medical business and you don't know anything and you're an anti-vaxxer. My answer to that is, well, shame all these people weren't anti-vaxxers. They wouldn't be dead and dying if they were anti-vaxxers. I am an anti-vaxxer. I'm not frightened to say it. Because I haven't also mentioned the fact that in 2016 I had a flu vaccination and ended up with pericarditis. So I've been well and truly primed to look into this. But the COVID vaccination was quite different and profoundly shocking. So it was about, I think it was September 2 years ago, I started with the Forest. I was just telling you how I started going to the Tunks Freedom in the Park movement, and that's where I had the incredible good fortune to meet Dr. Philip Altman. And Philip Altman...
Oh, he ran for Parliament.
Yeah, he ran for Manly.
Yeah.
He ran only to get the word out so that he could inform people. He has had 40 years in the pharmaceutical industry, so he was very well versed in how these things should be investigated. And when he saw the way the TGA was behaving, he realised that this was not fitting the normal pattern, and he became very seriously alarmed. The TGA, by the way, is 96% funded by Big Pharma. You might
Let's
know
get back to that in a minute. That is a
whole
rabbit
subject.
hole. That's a huge rabbit hole. But I just want to get back to the public support you get, because this is the key thing, I think, especially now that we're in the middle of an election. People have already started voting. People started voting in this election yesterday.
Yeah, I was there at the polls.
Yeah, well, that's right. And Australia is still recovering from, like I said, the greatest peacetime catastrophe, self-inflicted, in its history, and it hasn't even been mentioned in this campaign.
It's
now,
bizarre.
I want to ask you, what's your gauge on how much support or how much Australians now feel that they were hoodwinked during COVID and vaccines?
Interesting you ask about that, because just yesterday when I was at the Avalon polling booth, I met a gentleman who was a pilot for Qantas, and he said he had to take 3 vaccines, and he's very angry. He was forced to take a booster, much against his will, again, Nuremberg, and a week later they withdrew the mandate. I would be so angry. He said that now he feels the pilots that he said people don't like to talk about it, and the way the crews are put together, he said often you don't know the people that you're flying with, but he said there is a general feeling of disgust that they were forced into it. But he did come up with a very interesting comment. He said what people don't realise is what the lockdowns did to so many. And he described how the cabin crew are very sociable people who view their job as their friendship group, and obviously they go away to lovely places, and they'd have their whole lives were very much around the network of this. He said there were 18 suicides amongst the cabin crew because they couldn't cope with the isolation.
During the lockdowns?
Yeah.
18 suicides, and they're just the ones he knew. See, this is the thing about the COVID lockdowns and nearly everything that was imposed and mandated upon us. They were imposed and mandated by people who are not like us. Dan Andrews is not a sociable kind of guy. I don't think Gladys Berejiklian is either.
Frankly, I think they're psychopaths. I mean,
They're
look at what happened to him with that
accident. And these people
accident.
underestimate the consequences of being alone.
Yeah, well, I keep wanting to go back to a bit more about what set me off on this path before we go on to the forest. But it was when one of my sons rang me, and this was only in about June 21, it must have been, and a 6-year-old girl in my granddaughter's class died in her sleep. And that particular school was full of people who felt that they had to get their families vaccinated to show that they were brave and that they were going to combat this, and this was the way forward.
And they were doing their bit for the community.
Yes,
That's how it was sold.
That was how it was sold, and a lot of these people got their children vaccinated.
So your son had kids at this particular school. This is in Sydney?
No, in London.
In London, okay. And it was mandated that the kids...
Not mandated.
It wasn't mandated?
No.
But it was recommended?
Well, clearly it was recommended, and a lot of the parents there felt that they had to lead the way and show the path. But when he rang me and told me that, something really happened to me. I thought, now I'm going to play dirty. I've had enough.
So this is mid-2021?
Yes, it would have been. That's when I first started going to the chemist, and really started getting very upset about it. And I'd walk into a chemist full of people saying, "Oh, you're giving the COVID injection? Oh, yes, I've just heard about a 6-year-old who died in her sleep as a result of what you're putting into these people's arms." So yes, that was a turning point. And at that point, I then met Philip Altman. He was doing the campaign for Manly so he could spread the word about the dangers. And I spent a lot of time with him walking around Manly talking to people. What became very evident was that the medical fraternity were completely obsessed, whether it was because ARPA had got to them or whether it was in their DNA because of the way they were trained. Big pharma's got into all the education areas for medical people. And also they have a system where a patient comes in and certain age groups are looked at in terms of what can we give this person. If they're 80, they might want something arthritic. If they're 45, they might want something for heartburn. They've become very...
Essentially all doctors do these days at medical school is learn how to write prescriptions.
And interestingly, William Bay said that when he wanted to hear about he'd always been suspicious about vaccines. When he was studying for his medical degree, when the day for vaccinations came up, which he'd been looking forward to, he said, "I wanted to get to the bottom of this." The professor simply said, "Oh, we're running late. You all know that vaccines are the best thing that ever happened to mankind. We're not going to go into it any further than that. You know what to do. Follow the schedule and you'll be doing the right thing." And they accepted it. And in fact, I don't know whether you saw Insight, which was, I think, about a month ago, Dr. Rebecca Hoffman, who is the faculty chair of the Royal Australian College of GPs, on SBS, she said, "I only follow the science. I go to the experts. I don't question anything I'm told. I don't question my accountant. I don't question my lawyer. I believe what the experts say and I follow their guidance. Basically, that's what you should do," she was saying. Well, honestly, I thought I was going to hyperventilate and die when I saw that. I just thought that is what I hear every week at the forest. People who come to the Forest of the Fallen are waking up. There are very few people who don't know someone who's not well. But the problem is, and I wish, Fred, I could understand why, but people have come to me and said, "Oh, I have episodes where I can't swallow and I can't talk and I can't walk properly. The doctors are baffled, but I don't know what it is." And I'm thinking, have you looked into the neurological side effects of the COVID vaccine? They won't look at it. They won't look at it. I have elderly friends who have taken all of these, even though I've implored them not to. I think they're starting to wonder. Or one of these ladies, she's a little bit older than me. Her son's got a very nasty autoimmune disease. And I looked it up, and it is a side effect. And I've told her
The side effect of the
Pfizer.
COVID, of the mRNA.
It's in the Pfizer documents. It's a side effect.
Which particular autoimmune disease do you know?
It's called Behçet,
Right.
Behcet. It's a very nasty one. And her son.
And this kid was perfectly healthy before the
Oh,
vaccines.
well, he was about 45 years of age. But
Right,
yeah. Yes, yeah. Oh, The stories.
So as these stories accumulate, we all know someone who's died or been badly affected by them. As these stories accumulate and spread throughout the community, you must have noticed that attitude, general attitude in the Australian community change.
Oh, absolutely. But I'll just give you another odd example. I think it was at Collaroy. I mean, we cry every week, frankly. Something reduces me to tears every week. What I do is I put up all the ones with black ribbons of the people who've died in the front row, so that people walking past on the walkways, it gets their attention. And this guy came along and he was looking at it, and he looked quite fit, and he was aged about sort of 65. I said to him, hi, how are you? And he said, oh, I'm really well. And he said, gosh, this is shocking to see all these people who've died from the vaccine. And I said, yes, it's pretty upsetting. And I said, did you have to have any? He said, oh, yeah, I took 3. And he said, but I've really dodged a bullet, haven't I? I haven't had a heart attack or a stroke. And I said, no, you've been very lucky. I hope you're aware now that these haven't been a good idea. And he said, oh, yes, I think I've had enough. And I said, anyway, you're quite well. And he looked at me, he said, well, actually, no, I'm not. And I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. What is it? And he said, oh, well, I had my PSA done, and they said, oh, you've got prostate cancer. But then they found out that I've got cancer in my lung and my brain. And I said, I'm really sorry to hear that, but has anyone said that a lot of these cancers are coming from the vaccine? And he got really upset. We ended up having a hug and a cry together. And he said, I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I just find it extraordinary. But he's not unusual. I've got people who've had full body sepsis, and they don't attribute it. I mean, sepsis is off the charts now. We're hearing about it all the time.
What is sepsis?
It's when you have a blood infection that goes to all your organs. There was an MP in England who lost all 4 of his limbs from sepsis, and no one asks the vaccine status. But, we used to have a very occasional case of sepsis, but it's become so much more common now. It's very much more common.
Well, died suddenly as well. Young people dying of heart conditions.
2 people in the last week have spoken to me about it.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah, it was last Saturday. I was at DY, and a gentleman came and spoke to me, and he said, my 17-year-old daughter's friend, aged 17, died in her sleep. His parents don't attribute it to the vaccine. Apparently, I don't know. I mean, this is hearsay. And then on the strength of that, I got a phone call on Sunday morning, very distressing. A lady whose 21-year-old son died in his sleep. Terrible. He was Muslim. She wasn't, but her ex-husband was. He didn't drink or smoke or take drugs. And obviously because he was of the Islamic faith, he was buried quite quickly. But they did do what sounds to me like a very expedient autopsy. And they told her he had drugs in his system, and she doesn't believe it. Nothing would surprise me now. There's been such a cover-up. I know of someone whose son-in-law died in the shower, and this is a guess, but knowing the people involved, they were very pro-vaccine, and I think he died as a result. He was 35, dropped dead in the shower of a big heart attack. I guess these things can happen, but she was very quick to say it was nothing to do with the vaccine, and the paramedics said it was nothing to do with any vaccination. I think people were told, do not admit to the status because you will add to vaccine hesitancy, and by doing that you're doing a disservice to humanity. But getting back to people waking up, I do think that we are now at the pointy end. I have a friend she goes to critical incidents in Melbourne, and she's seeing huge problems with women losing babies on the 7th month. Topher Field interviewed a woman who was a funeral director, and she was saying that she used to do 1 stillbirth a month, and now she's doing 4 a week. And apparently what's happening is that the placentas of the people who've taken the vaccination are inadequate. So many of the problems are associated with clotting, and of course the placenta is full of blood vessels that clearly aren't operating properly, and they're getting what's called a floppy placenta, which is not nourishing the babies properly. The babies are very small for dates, and by the time they hit the 7-month mark, they can't be sustained anymore and they're being lost. And this friend said that she's going to a lot of heartbroken young mums who are losing their babies. I also interviewed a naturopath at Manly a couple of weeks ago, and she said she's been very aware of what's happening. She's had a lot of patients who've come to her. Initially, they were having all sorts of neurological problems, she said, but now it's fertility problems. Men who have sperm that just doesn't work like sperm normally works, and women with fertility problems that are becoming really apparent now. Well, so many young girls have said to me that that they've had horrible constant bleeding and things.
Well, that was the first thing, one of the first things that became apparent. Naomi Wolf was all across that early on in 2020, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's been an attack.
Menstrual cycles were completely disrupted and severely disrupted in painful ways. But of course, it's a man's world. That didn't really cause much concern back in the day, did it?
No. Well, what's something that was causing a lot of concern with men was when they put out the boosters was when I started getting a lot of parents coming to me. Honestly, it's been such a strange experience, this, because they'd come in rashes, blocks of things. And I remember one time, within about 3 weeks, we had several, there was 2 fathers and a mother who came and saw me and said, my son was 17 or 16 or 18, his heart's damaged. One of them said, I've spent $30,000, not that I mind, but I want my son back. I've spent $30,000 in medical problems. Actually, even worse than that is my friend Connor Briggs, who's 23. He got 2 Pfizer injections, and on the night of the first one he was ropey, but the second one he ended up in hospital covered in those ports all over his chest, having shocking problems. And his heart hasn't been the same. He's had every test under the sun. I think it's about $190,000 he's incurred in medical expenses, none of which he's getting back, no consideration. He cannot get anyone in the medical fraternity to admit that a young man who used to run 10,000 metres a day gets a Pfizer injection, ends up that night in hospital having heart issues, and now can't climb the stairs to his bedroom. Correlation's not causation, apparently. I mean, these people are so obtuse you could scream.
Where do the people that you meet who have had these bad experiences, there's nowhere for them to go?
No, and it's really difficult because, of course, the cardiac people, they're very reluctant to stain their record by saying he's had a problem with the vaccine. Just to elaborate on that, I went to see Sophie Scamps. This was in November. And she was basically, her hand was forced to see me because she was filmed by someone saying, oh, yes, ring me on Monday and I'll make sure we meet. Because I've been trying to meet with her for weeks.
So just to be clear, Sophie Scamps is a Teal member of federal parliament for the Northern Beaches.
And running for Mackellar again.
Mackellar, yep.
And I said to her, I'd like to bring 2 of the mothers, one being Connor's mother and another being Brittany's mother. These 2 women have had children who have been severely injured. I mean, Brittany, Shona's daughter, took a second jab so she could continue her studies as a physiotherapist. She ended up in the gutter outside the Northern Beaches Hospital because they said, you're just anxious. She was having severe heart problems. She was 19. Beautiful kid, really smart, and she's not one of these melodramatic people. Her heart has been so badly damaged, and I believe they've got $250,000 worth of medical expenses. Anyway, when how
is she now?
They're not well. They're not.
So 3 years later,
she's
still suffering. And did she ever finish her physiotherapy course?
I don't think so. But not only that, they've got PTSD. I mean, you can imagine.
Of course they have.
But I went to Sophie Scamps and she gave me an hour of her time. And I said to her, look, I've got the mothers outside. Oh, no, I just want a one-on-one with you. I thought, no witnesses. But during the course of the conversation with
So hang on a sec. She refused. These are her constituents who had been severely affected by a government-mandated medicine, and she refused to see them. And they were outside in the foyer.
Well, they weren't in the foyer. They were having coffee around the corner. I said, I can get them in. She said, I would have had them in if I'd known. But she knew because I emailed her saying I was inviting them. So, I mean, it's very, very shallow obfuscation all the time. It makes me sick. Anyway,
well, it casts a very clear light on representative democracy.
Shocking.
These were
a doctor
her constituents.
And a mother. She'd have to know. Anyway, I just have to finish with what she did say. She said, it's not that I'm not doing anything. And I said, oh, well, what are you doing? She said, well, I'm in contact with these people at Converse. And I said, they want Vaccine Injured to get some money, but they're not saying the injections are fatal and dangerous. She said, oh, no, they're not. She said, anyway, I will contact the cardiologists and I'll get my information from the cardiologist. And I said, well, good luck with that, because my friends have got children who are going to cardiologists and they won't tell them straight what's going on. Do you think they're likely to tell you? I don't think so. Anyway, and then I got onto the subject of ivermectin, which made her almost hyperventilate. And she just said, oh, what rubbish. No. Ivermectin is now known to be a cure for it. She's a doctor and a mother and a representative of us. It is her duty to find out what's happening. And if she's still ignorant about ivermectin, what else doesn't she know about? And yesterday I was at the polls. The Teals are obsessed with climate change. I'm going to go off track for a minute. Anyway, I asked one of these people who was going crazy about climate change, how much carbon is in the air? Oh, I don't know, lots and lots. I said, yeah, 0.04. It's been like that for decades. She said, oh, where did you hear that? I said, oh, Ian Plimer. Oh, he's an idiot. And I said, well, at least he knows how much carbon dioxide's in the atmosphere, unlike you people. But they're obsessed with this, and she will not hear about, she doesn't want to know about anything else. She just doesn't.
Well, the irony is that people who are fomenting action to prevent climate change are doing so to keep us safe. And if you want to keep us safe, then probably an easier and more direct way would be to prevent people getting jabbed by these poisons.
Yep, I would have thought so. These people don't have a conscience. I've seen her. I saw Rory Amon and told him, that's all gone to hell, but I won't go down that path, you might know. And then I presented the Port Hedland documentation and made a presentation to the Northern Beaches Council. That was in...
What's the Port Hedland documentation? So the Council of Port Hedland?
That was a man called Adrian McRae, who was a resident in Port Hedland, and he saw that the Aboriginal population, again, Aborigines do not tolerate vaccination well. And he said they were having to set up a new morgue because 4 times as many Aboriginals were dying as a result of the vaccination than normally happened. And they made a presentation, it must have been at the beginning of November or perhaps the end of October. They made a presentation to the Port Hedland Council, and the council took a vote, and they voted against stopping it because it was just so...
They voted against stopping.
They voted to stop.
To stop. That's what I'd heard. Yes.
Yeah, they voted to stop, which I mean,
to stop mandated vaccines.
Or to stop vaccinating at all.
But the council doesn't have any power over that.
They have a duty of care. They do, and there've been 4 or 5 councils who've subsequently made the same decision. There is a duty of care. If you look into what the council's all about. But our Northern Beaches Council seems to be drip-fed from the World Economic Forum, frankly, because they are just high-handed. You know, they spent something like $250,000 doing a survey as to whether we should raise our rates, which the entire public said no, but they raised it anyway. They're not at all interested in
Well, again, like I said a minute ago, this is representative democracy in the 21st century. There is no representative, and it's not democracy. Can we just actually segue to this current federal election? Mm-hmm. Why, I'll say it again for the 3rd time in this conversation, COVID and the vaccine mandates were the biggest catastrophe in Australian peacetime history. Why is it not mentioned in this current election?
Well, you'll find the Libertarians are talking about it.
Yeah.
John Ruddock and Craig Kelly is an absolute hero. I mean, how many men of his age would have walked away from a cushy superannuation and a seat in the Liberal Party, in a secure seat, because he was going to tell the truth? That man is a hero beyond words. And he's
been in here.
Yeah, he's the person we need in the Senate. John Ruddock and the Libertarian people who are on the Northern Beaches, they're all the representatives of the candidates in the Northern Beaches are very new to politics, but we're being steered by people like John Ruddock and Craig Kelly. And I think if we can get people like that into, because they are going to ask the awkward questions. My main concern is the WHO. If you look up James Roguski and see what he's been saying, he did the deep dive into this. He was not interested in anything to do with health until a couple of years ago when he realised what the WHO pandemic treaty was going to mean. We must vote in freedom parties who are concerned about this, because if we end up going along with the latest WHO treaty, we will be mandated to take vaccination. And I can see, having seen the experience we've had over the last 5 years, it's not out of the realms of possibility that we'd be force vaccinated. I can imagine there'd be a situation where that might well happen.
Can you be more specific about what the latest WHO treaty? We've got like days left to get out of it, haven't we? When does?
I think it's mid-May. But
and can you? What is the treaty? What does it dictate?
Well, they want to be able to decide when there is a pandemic, and their history, their track record's very poor because we didn't have a pandemic; we had flu. They want to be able to say when we lock down, and what the treatment's going to be, and who's going to get the treatment. Well, I think there's too much in place now in terms of quarantine centres that have been built all over the country, to not have a moment of pause and think, well, we've had it shown to us fairly clearly what these people are capable of, and I think we should take it on board. But it's curious that so many people seem to have amnesia. I noticed particularly in the UK, I've found it very, very curious. I've spent time in various places there. I stayed with a family member down in Exeter, and she was saying to me, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't know who Klaus Schwab or Fauci are.
Well, there's a lot of that around. Before we move on to Schwab and Fauci, though, who's behind the WHO?
Well, it's that Ethiopian terrorist at the moment, but I don't know who's dangling his strings. I don't know who's in control of him.
Tewodros.
Gazis, whatever his name is.
Yeah.
I've never got his name right.
Yeah.
I can see his ugly face, but no, I can't think of how to pronounce his name. But, his provenance is very bad. He's been guided, he's in cahoots with China. So none of these people are squeaky clean, least of all Klaus Schwab with his fancy dress.
So the current the current treaty would abdicate our sovereign responsibility to respond to a so-called pandemic, whether it exists or not, to the WHO. Has either side of either of the two major parties in this current federal election declared a side in this
No,
debate?
not that I know of.
They're not even talking about it.
What frightens me is that both wings of the same bird are pushing the ID, and that is a very dangerous thing to be doing.
Yeah.
We won't be able to access our bank accounts or the internet or anything if we don't have a social...
Well, the digital ID will become the digital vaccine passport quite quickly.
Absolutely. There's no question that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Yes, so I don't know why one would choose one against the other in that case. They're both as bad as each other, but fiscally Albanese is even more ridiculous than Dutton.
I thought one of the turning points I thought would happen initially in March 2020 when I saw that graphic in the Australian about it was mostly only people over 80 would be severely affected by COVID, that I thought would be a turning point, and for some reason it wasn't. But then the next year and the year after that, when Victorians were denied the AFL Grand Final because it had to move interstate because Victoria was in lockdown, I thought that would be a turning point.
So stupid. Was one state more infectious than the other?
Well, I mean, I've got skin in this game. My mother died in September 2021, and I wasn't allowed back for her funeral, but at the same time, two AFL teams and their entire entourages were, because they played the grand final in Perth that year.
Oh, it's disgusting.
But what I was trying to get at was that the turning point should have been, like, the only religion in Victoria is AFL. And when they lost their grand final, you'd think that Victorians would have said, okay, now you've gone too far. Why don't Australians respond to their buttons being pushed that badly?
Where is the Australian larrikin? Why were so many big, strong men bossed around by pimply young 15-year-olds saying you can't go in the supermarket now without your mask and you've got to wait till 5 people come out? I don't know. I was never made like that. I'm a pain in the neck and I just won't be pushed around.
What makes
like
you different?
I don't know. I'm very curious. And also, I don't know whether it's age or the fact that this whole thing is bigger than me. I don't know why this has landed on me. Every time I think, oh, I've done my bit now, something else hits me around the head and I think, oh, I can't be quiet about that. It's sort of landed on me and I can't look away. And it started with Philip Altman when I was on the hustings with him at Manly and a young man came up to me. I can see his face and we've stayed in contact. A handsome, beautiful young man came up to me and he said, I was in the army. We basically were guinea pigs. My platoon of 40 all got Pfizered and 15 of us have had heart conditions.
15 of 18.
40 young men.
15 of 40 fit young men who had signed up to defend the country, and then the government of that country had mandated a poison that had damaged their hearts.
Grandmother came to me, Balmoral Beach, and she said, my grandson couldn't sit his exams without taking these jabs. His heart basically exploded. They can't believe he survived.
So one of the statistics that is difficult for defenders of vaccines to explain is excess deaths. What's your take on the excess deaths since the vaccines were rolled out?
Well, since they were rolled out, we're running in excess of 100,000 excess deaths in Australia. There have been 1 million...
In 5 years?
Yep.
So an excess of about 20,000. So these are 20,000 people who have families and children and businesses and other people who rely on them, who have died as a result of the government-mandated vaccine.
Well, the worst year was the year of the booster. The booster was what really hit people. In fact, I got talking to a paramedic down at Mona Vale Beach. He was having his lunch, very nice young man. And I said to him, have you noticed a big uptick in cardiac issues since the rollout? And he said, oh, wow, the year of the booster, I was flat out the whole time. In England, there are 1,000 people a day applying for assistance, physical assistance, because they no longer can cope living on their own. And there's been a 21% increase in NDIS here in Australia, but no one seems to want to know why. It's extraordinary. One of the other things I think we need to be aware of is the fact that the hospital protocols and the protocols for pregnant women are still very injurious. Remdesivir, which Fauci used for Ebola unsuccessfully because 53% of his patients died from it, is still the protocol for treating COVID here in Australia. And my understanding is that the protocol decided by whoever, if it's not followed, there are ramifications for those doctors not complying. So they are giving people on the protocol remdesivir, which destroys people's kidneys. And I think that that's very responsible for a lot of the excess deaths, which of course they'll say is COVID. But the other thing that I'm really upset...
So if anyone watching this happens to get COVID, the last thing they should do is go to a hospital because they might be...
given remdesivir. And it's actually got another name. I think it's Velcari or something. They're giving it out under another name because a lot of people wised up to it. But the other thing that I think needs instant rectification is that I had my children in 1982 and 84, and there was no way anyone suggested I should have a vaccination during the pregnancy. Now they're vaccinating pregnant women with the DTP, which is diphtheria, tetanus and pertussis. And pertussis is a particularly nasty vaccination. Then they're giving them RSV the latest COVID and the flu. They're getting 6 vaccinations and they're wondering why women's placentas aren't working properly.
This is while they're pregnant.
While they're pregnant. And the pertussis, look, let's be mistaken, pertussis is very nasty, but being vaccinated while you're pregnant is not likely to help if your baby gets pertussis. It is no protection. And just recently I read about a young mother. It was the saddest story. I mean, these things just... I'm a grandmother, and I tell you, it's like a stab in the heart hearing these things. She gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and the child died at 10 days old of whooping cough. But she'd been vaccinated while she was pregnant. And there is a view that the vaccination is possibly linked to the child getting... I mean, the child would not have been out in the open air. She would have been in hospital and then home again. I can't imagine that she'd be in crowds where she's likely to contract pertussis. But what upset me...
Sorry, did she correct?
The baby died at 10 days old of pertussis. Yeah.
And are you meant to catch that in from other people or something? Is that how you...
Well, it's a virus.
It's a virus, okay.
But when you're vaccinated against it, what it does is if you're infectious, it lessens your symptoms, so you get through it more easily, but you don't realise you're infectious. And that's where a lot of problems arise with people saying, oh, you must have the pertussis injection before you come and visit me with the baby. I have no way of knowing but what that situation was. But what I found profoundly upsetting was the news article said this mother did all the right things. She got the pertussis vaccination while she was pregnant and her baby died of pertussis. This is a call out to everyone to go and get your pertussis injection. And I just thought, how can they possibly push this logic? This woman did that. The baby died of pertussis. Isn't this time to question whether
That's Orwellian.
It is.
It's Orwellian.
But that was the response. And this article in the paper was flooded with comments saying, oh, the poor woman, yes, I'm going straight out and getting my pertussis vaccination. I mean, I don't understand the logic. And this is what I mean, that this is why my brain seems to work differently. To me, that's a warning sign.
I mean, so it's interesting that you bring up the media. Why do you think the media fell so willingly for all this propaganda?
Well, firstly, I think that the whole way the media works, I mean, I remember old school media, and you would remember this too, where you answered to an editor who was a really hard taskmaster. He'd say, if it's wrong, it's your fault. You've got to tell the truth. And it was a good 15 years ago, I incrementally woke up to things. One of the first things I realised was the media was being dishonest. And then I had the experience of the medical people not telling me the truth. And then I realised the politicians weren't telling me the truth. And then I realised the judiciary was compromised, and the politicians and the scientists and all these other people. And I actually believe that it is too much for most people once they look down this rabbit hole and they realise the depth of deception they've suffered under. And the media has a massive responsibility as far as this is concerned.
Well, I think we learned during COVID that the media has evolved over the past century or so on the assumption or the sales pitch that it speaks truth to power, that it represents its readers' interests against big business and big government. And I think we learned during COVID that that's actually not true.
Failed.
They represent big business and big government, and they tell their readers what to do and think.
They failed, and there's going to be retribution. This is something else I think I should say. I'm seeing now at the Forest, previously, there was some sort of funny guilt that people... they'd taken these vaccines and they felt foolish, or they felt guilty, or they were made to feel like they weren't part of any tribe now. They weren't pro-vax and they weren't anti-vax. It's very hard to see exactly what their minds were thinking. I have had contact with a lady who wrote a very upsetting article. She said, can you imagine how you feel when you've taken these vaccinations and you realise that you were conned? And then you get sick and you realise that there's no one to help you. And she's my talisman. Whenever I hear people saying, oh, weren't they stupid to take 5 injections or whatever, I've met a lot of people like that darling woman Celia who I met at Coleroy Beach, and her video was part of my journey because that had millions of views. She took 5 vaccinations and she lost the ability to swallow, speak or walk. Wasn't a dry eye in the house that day. But these people in good faith, they felt either embarrassed or something, but I think they're getting past that now and they're actually quite angry.
So you think there's a certain element of embarrassment that people fell for this?
I think perhaps there was, and I wish they didn't feel like that because such a very clever con job was perpetrated on them. I don't have any time for people who are unkind to... I do get very impatient with the people who are trying to pull us down and call us cookers and that sort of stuff. I mean, I get a lot of ridicule like that. Sometimes I bite back, but most of the time I just don't bother. I mean, every now and then they hit me at a bad moment when I've just spoken to someone like this woman, Kelly Carr, who contacted me on Saturday. She lives up at Tweed Heads and she is suffering so badly.
What's her story?
Well, she was a chef and she was fit and she used to play women's rugby. Anyway, I had a chat with her. She contacted me on Twitter and I said, I think I need to hear what's happened to you, Kelly. She now is suffering with stiff body syndrome, which is what Celine Dion has. She's also had reactivated Epstein-Barr. She's got Hep B now, and she's also got shingles, and she's in a huge amount of pain. Anyway, she sent me a little video of her struggling to get down the steps of her home and struggle into her mobility scooter. So I coincided that with the video of that appalling, I can only say malfeasant idiot who doesn't want to know the truth about what she's pushing, and that is Dr. Rebecca Hoffman on Insight saying she sticks with the science. I sent out a video of Kelly in this state of extreme pain and distress, and then the doctors who we're supposed to be listening to saying I follow the experts and I don't believe in any vaccine hesitancy. We all have to do what the experts say. It's like we're in parallel universes.
So you've been doing this for 4 years now. You've been at the front line of what seems to me to be a battle between good and evil.
No question.
Is that how you see it?
Absolutely no question. And the people who, I don't know whether they realise they're being evil, but their absolute willful ignorance and to inject into a baby a Hep B vaccination at birth that has more aluminium in it than is recommended for a 300-pound man into a newborn child who has no blood-brain barrier, and they put that into a baby and watch it scream, and they've known since 2002 that the cause of autism is very, very strongly related to this. I don't know how they live with themselves. I do not know how they live with themselves.
What makes a person good and another person evil?
I think we're all a bit of a mix, aren't we? But
well, Solzhenitsyn said the line between good and evil is drawn through every man's heart. So we all have potential to be both. But what puts you on this side?
The children. The children.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.